That's what's interesting about Americans is that, and probably Canadians as well, is that people are bringing themselves together into big urban environments. People want to live in New York and LA and Austin much more than they want to live in suburban areas. And that's, the internet's fault. That's a lot of different things' fault, that people are just seeing these vibrant cultures. They want to be part of it. But then at the same time, another big trend is people just massively complaining about like homelessness and crime and a lot of things that we can talk about how they need to be reined in, but at the same time, I mean, these are kind of just parts of the urban experience. It's like when I lived in New York for all those years, by no means did I think that I had the right to complain about homeless people being out on the street. That's just part of living in New York,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the homelessness here is particularly special. I've definitely seen homelessness in every country, even in Ethiopia when I was living there. Like, I've seen a lot of homelessness, but LA homelessness is different. Even it's different from New York homelessness. Like here, they're like aggressively in your face, and they don't even want money sometimes. They just get in your face.
Well, there's no comparison for New York, where in LA we have Skid Row, 30,000, I think, people basically created this fucking whole society of tents and shit that they could just live within. And there is some sick, depraved shit going on in there. There are children living in there.
Oh, yeah.
There's God knows what going on in there. And New York doesn't really have an equivalent of that. They're way harder on the homeless, and it's a much more accommodating place to live in LA.
I realized it was weird when I was dating a girl and she said she wanted to go visit Skid Row. I was like, why? It's like, I just want to see what it's like in there. I was like, do you think this is some random tourist attraction for you to like visit? But people take an interest. It's become like part of the things that folks want to see when they come to see. I want to see the depravity. And it's actually super dark. I actually walked through there one time at night by accident when I was coming back. I was coming back from one of the shopping areas downtown, and then I was walking, and it started to really sink in how different it was when you see everything is boarded up, everything is kind of closed down, and you start walking a little bit, you're like, oh shit, and then you start seeing the tents. And for me, on the outside looking in, especially with the homelessness over here, why does it feel different? I think it feels different for me when I watch it, just because not only the abundance of it, not only does it feel extra ignored, but it's strange how I'm used to panhandlers. I'm used to folks that have mental health issues, but generally are looking for something. Here, it doesn't seem like that's always the case. Here, it doesn't even, like, sometimes you'll hand people money, they'll say thank you. Here, man, you might get the opposite reaction. They might fight you right afterwards. Like, they're really going through some stuff, and they've been going through for some time. And so it feels distinctly different from any place I've ever been to. And not even just the density of, like, Skid Row. I'm just talking about even individuals, like when I'm taking the train to Santa Monica or whatever. They're doing something different. You know what I mean? They're not asking for stuff in the same way.
Yeah, I don't think that in America I've seen anything close to it. Maybe when you talk about San Francisco or Portland, I've heard that those places are pretty gnarly at this point in time. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a uniquely West Coast thing where that's just sort of where they get guided. And a lot of people just end up in this lifelong cycle of drug abuse and just, mental illness. And it's tough because I think it's the one thing that, if people are honest with themselves, that both parties clearly do not have an answer for, that it's just too gigantic of an undertaking, and society is not willing to stomach the absolutely insane amount of money that it would take to just build housing for every fucking homeless person. And people also just don't like the incentives of the idea of like, oh, you can not do shit and then we'll just take care of you, and it's I don't know, it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain degree of homelessness that's kind of due to personal choices and stuff like. But then some of it is just financial. Like, I know friends who go in and out of homelessness.
Really?
Yeah, I'm sure you know people. Like, when you're on the come up, there's people who have a place and then they don't. And then you have to imagine, you just takes a couple wrong decisions at that point for you to really get into the streets and then stay there in permanence, right?
Right, but that's the thing, is that almost everybody I can think of, even the worst drug addicts and the people who had the hardest time going on, they always seem like they had a friend group that they could fall back on, that they could find a girl who would take care of them, that their parents would take care of them. I don't know that I've ever really known anybody in my life who was like anything close to a friend that really became full-blown homeless drug addict living on the streets, because they all had some degree of safety net that could kind of, save them at some point. And that is the scary thing that most of us never have to contemplate, is like, there's a bunch of shit that can go wrong in your life, and and a bunch of those things have happened to us, but we've all been able to make it work in one way or another. And a lot of people, if you imagine all your family members dying, if you imagine your financial situation just being much worse than it is, then it really could happen to anybody.
Yeah, that's a frightening thing to imagine. And I think when And it definitely tracks pretty well. But generally, when things get more expensive, you know what I'm saying? When times get more difficult in terms of finance, in terms of like the world economy, you definitely see homelessness spike completely. Now, there's plenty of people who recover from that and then find a place and find a job. But the ones who end up getting into drugs and then go deeper and deeper into that hole, that's generally where it starts. And then, you know, I think that's a pretty straight line. I think you can find, as Los Angeles has gotten more expensive and things have gotten hard over here, the homeless problem has definitely spiked. And it's hard to fix because it's not something you can just throw money at, because the society that kind of fermented or fomented this issue itself still exists. And so there's going to be a new batch of people who will take those places.
Because during COVID, it was like certain areas in certain areas of the valley, like parking lots that you're just used to seeing, you know, a handful of cars parked in, and then all of a sudden they just become overrun with homeless people. And I'm driving by it every day and just thinking, like, these are mostly people. Some of them were probably already homeless and they relocated, but these are mostly people who became homeless as a result of the pandemic and shit. Like, these are people who probably had some sort of normal life going on, and these circumstances that I'm oblivious to just fucking put them living in this parking lot. And that's a fucking scary ass thing to just kind of witness that happen to people.
Yeah. Have you watched like a lot of interviews with homeless folks? There's like people
On
who
Software
do like,
Underbelly, yeah.
Okay. People do like street interviews with them, and you ask them, like, they talk to them about their stories, and you find like, yeah, I had a business and then it failed, and I just felt so ashamed, and my wife was unhappy, and then, you know, I couldn't pay anything, and then she left me. And like, you'll hear stories like that. You hear people like, you know, I was at a party with, you know, conference, and then started taking drugs and got deeper, and then lost my job, and then kept taking the drugs. Like, it tracks, like, not always with economy, with like just generally drugs at the basis of it, but also for a lot of people it is money. And so when I look at the pandemic, for example, people see like a rise in crime. Well, where did that come from? Well, things got harder for most people financially. At the same time, rent, housing prices, everything exponentially rose.
And people got a taste of having some disposable income with all the money that they were giving away, which I think really warped a lot of people's brains as to what to expect out of life.
Fair. Yeah, you got everything cross-section. But, like, yeah, during the last 2.5 years, crime jumped. Like, I think it's like 75%. And I don't know if you felt it out here.
Well, when you see these statistics, and you'll see a lot of, like, people on Twitter trying to argue that, well, actually, crime hasn't gone up that much. And it's like, motherfucker, do you know how few crimes are reported? You know, like, a big part of the fact that of crime in LA. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm lucky it's only happened to me one time, but there was kind of like this babbling homeless person that was kind of like outside my apartment, sort of saying some weird shit to my girl. Yeah. Kind of a scary situation, because it's like, if I wasn't in the house, then who knows what could have happened. He could have tried to follow her into the house, whatever. But you know, we're lucky to have a gate outside our house and everything. But yeah, like, she asked me to call the cops. I call the cops. They put me on hold for like 15 minutes. There's no chance. I'm like, there's nobody that I don't have a conversation with. And by this point, he's gone. And I'm just thinking, like, what the fuck am I going to do? Like, this is stupid as fuck.
Yeah.
But there's an example of a crime or a sticky situation that would have been counted towards crime statistics, but they never even got a chance to find out that there was something going on, because, I mean,
all my friends told me in the last like 4 years, they all had their cars broken into at one point or another.
Right.
That became like super common for folks to have to deal with.
Yeah, and if you talk to people up in San Francisco where the Bippin epidemic is so big, it's fucking insane. Bippin is like, I think you take a car antenna, or is it a spark plug, or they have something that just like breaks the window super easily.
Okay.
And so they can just do it insanely fast, just like take all your shit out the back of the car. They have videos of people doing it in traffic where the car will stop at a red light and they just walk up, boom, grab the camera equipment out the back.
That's crazy.
Fucking gnarly, dude.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But you have to imagine a lot of this, like I said, if it tracks with the economy and things getting financially harder, it's like, it's not a sexy thing to talk about, just because when you think of the economy, everyone's like, that's too nebulous, it's too big. And so I understand it, but it always tracks with that. And I think as things get more difficult, it tracks across dating, it tracks across like job opportunities, crime. Like, when things get financially more difficult, right? All of a sudden you move back in with your parents. I mean, listen, trying to date when you live with your parents, that shit ain't the same no more. You know,
I believe it, yeah.
You know, but how you gonna afford a place to stay when like your rent has gone up exponentially, right? Like, I know friends who like their rent jumped up 800 in the last 2 years. I'm like, bro, that's a hard thing to stomach when you've just been living paycheck to paycheck, right?
Yeah.
And so that affects folks. You don't have as much disposable income. You have to take up extra hours. You can't have as much time, or maybe you're just feeling financially priced out, a bit of ashamed of the fact that you ain't got your finances. Like, as a man, how you gonna be able to date properly?
Right.
And so like all of these things compound into like making society overall worse for people. Now, you and I are pretty insulated from it because we have that financial flexibility. If anything, think we strive.
But when you said the rent going up by 800, I was just like putting myself in the mental state that I was at 10 years ago, where that would have been impossible for me to even comprehend.
Yeah, I mean, that's me being generous. I know people who were dealt with way more than 800 because in some places where there's no rent control, like the landlord can do whatever the fuck they want, especially if they know other tenants are going to scoop that bitch up. And so that's those issues that you have in place.
Yo, we just hit 400,000 subscribers right here on the Clips channel. So if you want to help us out, click subscribe, get us to 500K. Yeah.